So this guy in the front row said, would you come out to, the annual meeting? And, I figured I was going to give colon 101 or something like that. And he said, what we want to do is, what's going to be the next 10 years in oncology practice? So like I have some secret vision into the future, and that I'm going to now tell you how the next 10 years are going to go, and you can decide to get on the boat and ride or not, I guess. But the more I thought about this, the more I thought what a wonderful challenge to try and put together a little bit of a vision and some roadmap about where we're going in the future. And I don't think you're going to find anything in here overly surprising, but it does represent a new world for us, and we're going to have to adapt to this new world, and we're in the middle of it right now, if you will. But I want to kind of drill down on some specific issues that I think many of you are familiar with, but maybe not have thought about on a drill down sort of level. So we're going to have lunch. We're going to spend about 45 minutes together reviewing our futures. And as usual, I hope we have a little fun along the way. So let's start with the sort of basics of where we are now and the business of oncology that it is today. And if you look at our cancer care stakeholders, there are a lot of old people here. I know many of you from decades of coming to these meetings. In the old days, oncology was a very close-knit group, and we partnered with our pharma people. We could actually have a cup of coffee with a member of the pharmaceutical industry and not need to take a shower afterwards. And there was partnerships with academic centers and fellowships and the like, because we had lots of work to do in trying to cure cancer. And over the last couple of decades, oncology has succeeded. I think that's one of our messages, but it's also become tremendously big business. And so each of our stakeholder groups have now separated and become different silos, if you will, with their own motivations and their own agenda. And the FDA, of course, which is the primary stakeholder for all of us, has a priority called safety and efficacy, and we'll come back and drill down on that a little bit. The payers, our real parents, if you will, they're all about cost control and value. They'd like to keep us from spending much of the money, and cancer care has certainly gotten very expensive, and so they've had to step in and intervene to make sure that we're behaving in the right way, in the best way we can. The National Cancer Institute and CTEP used to have as their mission to cure cancer, but if you look on their mission statement website right now, you won't find the cure word. What you will find is language around research coordination. So they've already thrown in the white towel, the white flag on curing cancer. Pharma is all about markets and return on investment. That is their primary goal. Their business, they do a good thing. What their business is good for others, but it is all about making some money. Community oncologists, most of you out there in the audience today, your primary motive is to deliver efficient quality care. Turn the chairs, turn the clinic, but have the patient and your staff be happy on the other end of that. Whereas I, as an academic oncologist, have a different metric. My boss, my cancer center director, wants me to put a certain percentage of people on clinical trials. That is the NCI designated target for me as a clinician in a comprehensive cancer center is how many patients, what percent of patients do I enroll on a trial? So that's my atonement there. The advocacy groups are all about their cause is more important than your cause, right? So they're fighting for a piece of the pie, and they advocate very effectively, in some cases less well in others. Does anybody ask what the patients want? What do they want? All of them. The day before they die, they would like to be cured of their disease. And in many ways, we have also abandoned this thought for really turning cancer into a chronic disease. They do care about sharing with others and things like that, but they want to be cured fundamentally. All right? So what's the world? What happens in the world right now? So there are, how many people? 7 billion people in the world right now, only 1 billion of whom have access to cancer care. That's a fact, okay? So there's 6 billion people who have smartphones and Wi-Fi, but no access to cancer care. And they're increasing in age, as you can see from these figures, and the estimates are just skyrocketing, that in fact cancer will be the #1 global health problem over the next decade or two. So we're going to have more people with more cancers, higher costs, that you can see how this is spiraling into a dangerous place. Now, I just like to point out that when you put all the GI cancers together, we, in fact, are the most common, most fatal cancers on the planet. Screw the lung cancer, people. And if one looks at the next 20 or so years, we're going to see an enormous increase as we westernize around the world, and there's going to be just an enormous increase in the GI cancers and other cancers that are out there. Not only the incidence, but the mortality is a major public health problem. But you all know we live in this country. We live in a breast cancer nation, by far the most important cancer on our planet. Have raised more money than anybody else. Every drug that we try works in this disease. It drives me crazy. And not only does it works even better in adjuvant. You know, it's just, I'm pissed. You all know this about me. I'm not telling anybody in the room anything new. And you all also know that I've been advocating for what color ribbon? Brown ribbon. We need brown ribbons. We need them to be scratch and sniff if we could get away with it, but we never can. But I want to give you a new perspective on, I've got an idea for a new T-shirt for us in the GI colon cancer world. And I just want you to look, I think the front of the T-shirt should say this: F-U, 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 F-U. And it probably won't take you very long to figure out that that's 5 FUs right there. I mean, it's what it is. And so actually I made this joke, and a patient made me a bunch of these T-shirts. I now have these T-shirts, and I'm too scared to wear them anywhere. I was gonna wear it at GI ASCO and pop it, you know, like that. But I decided better, again, No, anyway, but you like this? Would you buy one of these T-shirts? We'll be selling them back over here later on. All right, everybody knows what today's all about. There are not enough of us. We're all busy, and we're all burnt out, right? It takes us till Sunday night to be caught up for Monday morning almost every week. And that's just the nature of our business. We are faced with more rules, more oversight. They know everything we're doing. I went to Starbucks. My wife and I have the same app, right? The same code at Starbucks. So I went to Starbucks and used my phone to buy a cup of coffee. And my wife, about 2 minutes later, texted me, "How's the coffee?" She knew that I'd never. So there's more rules, more oversight, more documentation. Who likes your EMR? Nobody? Who likes it when you couldn't? Remember the old days when you couldn't find the chart? You remember these days? So there's some elements of this that are good. But we're also siloed. How many different EMRs do you have to have open in clinic in order to see the patient in front of you? In my shop, it can be as many as 3 different EMRs that need to be open in order just to manage the one patient. It's more complicated for us to keep up. We've been having a discussion today, the GI crowd by email today has been having a discussion around conflicts of interest. And if you ever listen to my Medscape blog, the current one is on conflict of interest and how this witch hunt, if you will, has separated the brightest minds. And so we no longer can hear from the brightest minds because they're, of course, the ones who also have conflicts of interest. And so we really haven't solved how we're going to educate each other going forward. There's more competition out there and therefore more demands, and we all know what our RVU targets are. Our business model of buy and bill is eroding, and the margin is shrinking, and we're not really sure how it's going to go forward. And there's always the bottom line of medical malpractice, which does hang over us all in everything we do. This says try to focus less on a cure and more on a treatment you can afford. I think this is really where we're headed in oncology. And what we've been told is that we are to practice evidence-based medicine, right? That's what we're supposed to do. But let me just start this discussion about, looking at how we measure evidence. And there's level 1, 2, and 3 and grades. But I think the more you dig, you realize that different groups have different formula for what constitutes levels of evidence. So if you read that something's level 1 in one of your guidelines, it's not necessarily the same definition in others. So this isn't, fixed in stone, this definition. This is just one proposal of what levels of evidence should look like. And so, of course, 1A is a randomized trial and strong evidence in the clinic that this is working. But 2A is just a small randomized trial or series of phase 2s with some clinical evidence. And in fact, much of what we look at as guidelines day in, day out, NCCN and others, are really only founded on level 2 and below levels of evidence. So we need to make sure that we understand when we say we're practicing evidence-based medicine that there's not that much evidence in many cases. So the balance here between what the FDA sets of safety and efficacy is put across now by value. We didn't used to have to consider value in what we did, but more and more we're having to prove that what we're doing is actually useful and worth the money. But quickly we're going to shift away from value to something called outcomes. Who here thinks they have very good outcomes? Who here thinks the guy next to you has worse outcomes than you do? Right? So we all think we're the best damn doctor on the planet, right? And we know everything, and our little tweaks to drugs and doses are the right things, and we have the best outcomes. But how are we going to compare each other going forward? And we all know this is coming, but we don't know how it's going to happen. So what are we talking about with levels of evidence? Whose evidence? So mine, I am the best deliverer of capecitabine on the planet, or NCCN's. Is that the level of evidence that we need? Whose value? Again, an individual patient or a society. If it's society making a decision about stage 2 adjuvant therapy for colon cancer, you get a different answer than it's the individual. The individual wants the therapy, society says it's not worth it. So right now in the United States, we have an individual value judgment. Rest of world has a much more heavy emphasis on society. Is it best outcomes or least toxic and quality of life? How many times are we actually selling hope when we recycle a chemotherapy or try one more time with a treatment to a good performance status patient, when in reality we know good and well that that's very unlikely to work? Wide access. Should everybody who walks in our door have equal access, or depending on your insurance and your provider and all of that, should there be some level of restricted? We are rationing chemotherapy right now. We give different supportive care to different patients depending on their copays and their health insurance. Patients don't know that we're doing that, but we're doing it day in and day out. We need to come clean on this going forward. So when you look at evidence and value, the first, of course, is the FDA approval. But then once a drug gets on the market, there's this sort of slippery slope of utilization. So they get on compendia, so these don't have to match. So you can have guideline approval for a therapy that doesn't actually have that drug FDA approved, right? Just because through convention and clinical trials, but ultimately it's payer approval. We got to get it paid for, and then ultimately beyond that, legal approval and protection. So we have each of these layers that we have to get through before we make a therapeutic decision. How does the FDA and CMS work together? They don't. By law, they don't. So the FDA approves a drug, does not get the information on what that drug is going to cost. They approve the drug, throw it over the wall. CMS receives the drug and does not get the chance to make a value judgment, does not get to ask, well, how much did that drug help? If the FDA said it's in, CMS has to pay for it, and the price tag is set by the market, right? So, and not the federal government, at least in this country. And so this disconnect removes a value judgment from everything we do in the United States healthcare system. Here's one that embraces a value judgment. We think of the NICE committee as evil. This is the Great Britain strategy where they still get FDA approval or their regulatory approval. And if you have money, you can have the drug, pure and simple. But if you're going to use the public health service, this committee known as NICE actually makes a value metric judgment. And then if it meets a standard, they actually convert all of this to quality of life measures, and they have a dollar amount for how much quality of life is worth, And if the drug is priced at a place and the benefit is priced at a place that meets that value metric, it's in. If it doesn't, it's out, right? So the government, in this case, makes a value judgment on top of it in Great Britain. This sort of system is in place in other parts of the world, but this is the most striking. We also have to fess up to this point, is that poorer countries, some of that 6 billion out there that doesn't have cancer care, they're doing our trials, and then when the drugs gets approved, of course, they don't have access to it. They have no way of delivering it. So in a way, we have to worry about the ethics of this. There's no wonder that they're bombing us, right? Look what we're doing to them. We're using them for experimental trials. So this is our reality. This is our public perception in 2015. It's everywhere, okay? That we're racking up a major burden, a major financial burden on our society, right? $1 in $6 in the United States is spent on health care, and a large chunk of that is spent on cancer care. Can we justify what we're doing? Can we justify the cost of these medicines going forward? And if you think about this, does everybody have one of these closets? I have one. It's usually the coat closet, and it has soccer balls and lacrosse sticks and umbrellas and all sorts of stuff just jammed in there. And it's very much the same way as our healthcare system. It's full. And if we're going to actually bring in innovation, we've got to clean out the closet. We've got to find room, stuff we're doing now that doesn't make sense, that's not worth it, and get it out of the closet, quit doing it, so that we can bring in innovation, right? So if I could figure out which stage 2 colon cancer patient needed chemotherapy, right, I would avoid giving chemotherapy to over 90% of the patients that we're giving it to. But right now we treat everybody, okay? So if we could just figure those kinds of things out, we'd make room in our closets for more innovation coming forward. So when I sat down and thought about where we're going, I listed these items, and I'm going to cover a couple of them in more detail, and I'll skip over a couple just because we don't have time. I want to talk about outcomes a bit. I want to talk about guidelines. I want to talk about precision medicine that we've already been hearing a lot about this morning. I'm going to pass on immune therapy and the fact that we'll all become disease specialists and the world of general oncology may be shrinking. Does everyone in the room actually know what a biosimilar is? It's not a generic, right? It won't be dirt cheap. It'll be a little cheaper. And it may be a little different. Has anybody used the new one yet? Your buyers have bought it. I promise you. The people who buy your chemotherapy have bought the biosimilar because contracts are being made. It's going to be cheaper enough to where that's going to come in. And this is going to really change a lot of what we're doing in drug development. And then I want to close on value as a metric. All right, so outcomes. How are you going to measure this? Right now, the way we code patients is by ICD-9 codes, and that's fundamentally T&M staging. But we know darn well that T&M does not adequately reflect the variation that is within cancer. So in our current model is if you have the right ICD-9 code, you can be given the treatment that's on the guideline, on the pathway. So those are the two connections that we make, but it is purely empirical. Has anybody heard of Flatiron? You need to, right? Has anybody heard of CODA? We all know about McKesson. Each of these groups is working on measuring outcomes. So they're watching what we're doing in our EMRs, and they're building a business that embraces all sorts of things. How many milligrams of stuff do you use? How many tests do you order? How long are patients on treatments? And people are paying them to track how we're doing. And in fact, many of them, CODA being one, is actually forgetting T&M and going right to molecular profiling. Right? So let's get to the heart of these tumors and measure them on their molecular level instead of just plain old T&M and see if we can figure out once on the day you meet a patient that yes, you have cancer and yes, you're going to die February 3rd, 2017. Right? So that's the ultimate goal of trying to figure out an assessment of what a patient's going to cost and how well are we doing in those outcomes. So this business has started and we are the lab rats. Now the guidelines, many, many versions. Is everybody NCCN here? Is that what you use? What do you use? Yell one out. What else do you use? ASCO, some? They're all made differently, and I was very pleased that the GI ASCO committee actually accepted our proposal to break down the various guidelines that are existing, because in point of fact, the different guidelines around the world have the same data sets on which to base them, but they have different answers, right? So they have different recommendations, even though that's all the same global data. And most of the time, there's no emphasis on value or outcome. So the ASCO guidelines, they're out for appropriate treatment, areas that would benefit from practice guidelines, so where there's confusion. And they actually do list economic importance, but frankly, have not embraced the economics in this so far. NCCN, self-proclaimed, recognized standard for clinical policy in oncology, most comprehensive and most frequently updated. Is frequent update of a guideline good or bad? I accused the NCCN group at the meeting of this could be fad mentality. Some new paper comes out that's kind of hot, and so we're going to change the guidelines right away to reflect that, even though we haven't replicated that data and it may not be mature enough. So I worry about this on that level as well. ESMO, they want to give care options, whereas NCCN is giving a recipe down to the milligram. ESMO gives broad overview guidelines. You should try this kind of treatment, 5-FU-based treatment, something like that. And they're informed by leading experts. So this is more an overview. And then I've already mentioned the NICE guidelines, where they're measuring the clinical and cost effectiveness that are viable, that we can afford. So they bring this value strongly into the loop. All right, I want to shift next to precision medicine. We've talked about it all morning. We're now having to learn all of these damn molecular targets, and I can't keep them straight either. But we're going to. This is the way cancer medicine is going to go, and the hypothesis is that if we did molecular profiling on everybody, we'll in fact transform global cancer care. There are very few cancers today where you just stop at an H&E stain. Almost every cancer we take care of has additional molecular testing that's needed, and so this is evolving fairly rapidly. The concept is pretty simple. You have a patient, in the old days was H&E, and you gave them the same old treatment to everybody, but what we're hoping to move to is where we have individual treatment shoots for the different patients that have different molecular profiles. And so this is the vision of where we're going to end up. Is this the flow sheet of the future, right? Instead of a Chem 20, maybe we have a bunch of gene tests, and maybe we have those gene tests over time, where they might be changing up and down as we treat patients and take different and new biopsies. We're clearly seeing the more we biopsy and the more we test serial in patients, the more these are changing. So we do this one biopsy and one analysis, and we think that's the way it's going to be forever, and the more we're looking, the more we're recognizing these change over time. So how are we going to get drugs if we do this profiling thing, right? That's the struggle. Cool, let's do a big profile, and let's say we find HER2-positive colon cancer, okay? Well, how are we going to get the guy from Aetna, to pay for trastuzumab or something like that for our patient with metastatic colon cancer? So that's where you've started. You found some cool target, and the insurance company's saying no. Rich Shilsky is a very smart guy and a GI oncologist, now the chief medical officer at ASCO, put this proposal forward in 2014 of a relationship where now you ask and the drug company will give you the drug, but you agree in exchange to provide that company back with data. And maybe the insurance company as well. They get data on what happened to that patient. And so maybe just next time there's expanded regulatory approval and the insurance company will pay for it. This is Rich's proposal going forward, and I think it's a very good idea. And I suspect with enough pressure as we go forward, this kind of process will be embraced. And so you'll want to profile because you'll have access to these unusual mutations when you come across them. But I want everybody in the room to be very careful. Garbage in, garbage out. It's all about the tissue. If we're going to be doing molecular profiling on patients with cancer, we have to recognize that it's not all the same. The quality of the tissue matters a great deal. And the quality of the assay matters too. Here are two patients with identical molecular profiles, but in fact are signaling through two different pathways. So it may be much more than about the genes and the genes that are mutated, or even some of the proteins. It may be down to the phosphoprotein level that we're going to have to get. And in order to measure phosphoproteins, now all of a sudden we need frozen tissue, at least in today's world. There are a few labs that are doing it on laser capture microdissection with paraffin fixed. But this concept is one that you have to be aware of. And I want to go one further. As soon as the surgeon cross-clamps the artery on your patient's tumor, hit your stopwatch. If it takes more than 15 minutes for that tumor to get into fixative, more than 40% of the proteins in messenger RNA have changed. So a lot of our tumor banks are full of old, sat-over-the-weekend tumors, right? And we're using those as our library. We're using them as our reference standard. When in fact, when we start to dig down on proteins and message in these, it's garbage. This is just mTOR as one of those examples where it clearly changes just by itself, just from being ischemic. And of course, this is something we have to resolve. So, we believe we need to go in this direction. We think it's an incredible technology, but does it really reflect the tumor we're treating? We all cite the New England Journal paper where they took a renal cell tumor, biopsied it from 4 quadrants, and got 4 different profiles, the same ball of tumor. So there's clearly tumor heterogeneity, and it changes over time. We don't really even know what we should be measuring. We've started with DNA and next-gen sequencing because it's easy and you can do high volumes of it, and you get a lot of data points. But most of us feel like it's going to be something post-translational that's going to really be the soul and heart of our tumors. Should we do this in the tumor? Can it be in the circulation? We'd love it to be in the circulation, and many groups are working for this. And of course, we're all hoping that immune therapy will make all this just go away and we can all become rheumatologists or something else. So who's gotten a report that looks like this, right? You get these reports? They're like 20 pages long, right? And they have some summary on the front, and it gives you some recommendations. Some list drugs in the good column and in the bad column, and some in the maybe column. This particular version is they actually recommend regimens, and you get all of this alphabet soup of molecular tests from that. And what do you do with this? Nothing? Did I hear nothing? Scan it into your EMR. That's what you do, right? And then you're like, okay, I did it. That wasn't worth anything, right? So this is how we've got to move forward. We get Chem20s and we scan those into our EMR, and a lot of time forget those. But the question, when that abnormal lab value comes back, we know what to do with it. As we go, we're going to learn about how to interpret this data and incorporate it into our patients' medical care. So I can order the test today. I can get reports. I cannot help but be influenced. You see this thing looking at you and you wanted to give this drug. It's on the pathway, for God's sakes. And this report tells me it won't work. Who's got the nerve not to give it, right? And so we give it anyway, right? We ignore the test in that case. It's easy sometimes if you've got 2 choices and the test says A is better than B and both are approved. Well, heck yeah, I'm going to give A. This report says I should give you A. And then you're expecting, of course, the drug to work now, right? You feel more confident going in on that. So assays are really difficult. They're hard to replicate, and not all mutations are the same. So you just spent a lot of time learning about BRAF mutations in melanoma. Wells is going to teach us later about BRAF mutations. Same mutation in colon. It doesn't necessarily perform the same way. So what tomorrow will be, is what I would predict, is that profiling will predict the right treatment and that our outcomes will improve as a result of this, and we will quit giving negative therapy. When we give somebody 8 weeks of a drug or a treatment that didn't work, we almost certainly have shortened their survival. And we don't recognize it as that. We've given toxicity with no benefit, and almost certainly we've shortened their survival by some measure of time. that regulatory support would be there to approve this and shift over to value, and that the payers are going to start paying for this. Because quite honestly, until we responsibly don't give the drug that wasn't going to work, there's no savings. So more and more, this kind of molecular prediction and profiling will be part of our lives. How are we going to do this in a day-in, day-out fashion? You all have seen bucket studies or these kinds of assignment studies. But what I guess is that we will start doing a shared ownership molecular profiling, maybe even insurance companies dictating this. Why wouldn't they? We want to know what the molecular profile of the patient's tumor is right from the get-go, because it puts you on a different pathway. There'd be some standard pathway treatment, but there'd also be treatment choices that aren't going to be the same for every patient, because there are different molecules and different abnormalities coming out of these tumors. And so when there's trials in support of this, you'd have a second informed consent that would drive that. So to me, this is clinical research in the future, which embraces molecular profiling. Many trials like this are ongoing in some disease types already. Here's our problem for defining new drugs, and I just want to sort of point this out. So let's say I have a great drug that hits a target really well, but that target is only in 10% of colon cancer, okay? So that's actually a market that's worth going after. But in order to prove that, I just want to do a very simple, single-arm, phase 2 study, 50 patients, okay? But I want to get the study done before I die. I want to get it done in a year, okay? Well, if I only have 10%, I've got to screen 500 patients in that year, right, to get the 50. And that means 41 colon cancer patients with biopsy who are eligible every month to screen. Can anybody do that in their healthcare system today? So the only way we're going to do this kind of high volume, high flow process is through partnering. And there's several efforts at doing this. And this is an advantage of joining partners and joining systems and having those systems link and having the data be shared because we can do this kind of stuff. It is how everyone in this room would want to be treated, pure and simple. If you had one of these badass cancers and you had a biopsy and you know you were toast, you'd want to profile your tumor and you'd want access to every one of the cool drugs that's out there depending on what that profile said. So all we're trying to do is set up a system that enables that for our patients. And so we're calling these smart centers because that just sounds good. We could have called them smart centers. That would have been even better. And we're modeling this around GI cancer patients, obviously, because of my love and others in the room. But the idea is to profile everybody, that treatment would be applied, your outcomes would go, and there would be in this shared data bank the outcomes that could then report to regulatory as well as payers and the like. So this is where we think we're going. And as you enter in your data in your EMR this weekend, remember you're building this data cloud which will help cure cancer as we go forward. Now, I just want to quickly talk about this CARIS opportunity. We're trying to build together a group of centers and community practitioners who want to play together in such an initiative. And I just want to show this, because this is all that we've been doing a lot of next-gen sequencing, right? But a lot of the treatments that we have and that we give rely on other than next-gen sequencing. So when you hear people talk about being multi-omic, that's what they mean. They're not just sending off genes, they're looking at proteins and other elements of the cell as well. And so until we've really figured this out, we're all going to be kind of multi-omic people. And our idea behind this is to develop standards around this, to develop best practices and guidelines, to develop value-based reimbursement paradigms, clinical decision-making, outcomes data, all the things that we've been talking about we need. Teaching each other. I got an email today from ASCO to go to a molecular tumor board. Has anybody been invited to one of these? Have you been to one? Have you actually clicked and said, oh, I'm going to go see what the molecular tumor board's all about? That may be where we're moving, is that we are pathwayologists and less about primary sites of disease. Awareness in our community and partner with guideline committees to do this. I want to kind of end up on value as our new metric, because I think that's where we are all being pushed to go, and maybe rightfully so. Our current system enables this kind of clinical trial. You know, I always think about big clinical trials. Fellows come in and they want to present a big clinical trial at a tumor board, and I don't care anymore because, big clinical trials are a lot like middle-aged men in their cars, right? The bigger the car, the smaller the women get this, totally. No middle-aged man in this room just laughed. I think you all have very big cars. I drive a Hyundai, just so you know. So the reason I don't like big randomized trials is they're looking for small differences, okay? And are those clinically meaningful? Give me a small clinical trial with a big difference any day. But right now, the way we get drugs approved is it takes hundreds of thousands of patients, approaching $1 billion per drug, incredible risk for the gambler who's sliding those coins, the chips across the table to say, we're all in on this drug to make it all the way to approval. We accept an arbitrary p-value of 0.05, which means 1 in 20 of our trials is wrong. We accept an overall survival of 1.4-month delta. FDA approved, CMS is paying for it, and we hand it out. Okay? That's our current system of clinical trials. We're moving from consumption to outcomes, right? We are currently incentivized to treat patients. That's how we make a living. Our business, in fact, depends on it. And it's one of the reasons why in the US we're like our IV drugs more than our oral drugs. Our individual outcomes will be compared. So as we get measured in value, we're going to be compared, just like I have to compare every one of my faculty members' RVU productivity. We're all independently going to be in some big database in the sky. Forget the Sunshine Act. They're going to know how many RVUs you've got on a day-to-day, week-in, week-out basis. Insurance providers will therefore become even more influential as we are marked as what kind of provider we are in terms of outcomes. But in theory, costs fall and outcomes improve. And we're cogs in this machine unless we sort of deal with it. Could we, in fact, approve drugs based on value? And here's a little model that we've been working on at Georgetown, where instead of just the hazard ratio, we actually look at sort of the impact on society and the patient. So here's an easy one, a no-brainer, imatinib versus interferon for CML. A tremendous hazard ratio, an expensive drug, a lower toxicity profile. This is in. This becomes the standard by which we'd compare every other one. But then how about nilotinib versus imatinib, right? Now our hazard ratio is not so much. The drug's more expensive. Is this worth it? Is the delta worth it? Everybody, I think, has gone to nilotinib front line based on this increase. But if you had to swipe your own Visa card for it, I bet you'd take imatinib, right? I bet you would. But so we're not buying, so that's fine. It's okay. We'll write the one that's a surer bet, if you will. And then let's kind of go down. I mean, there's erlotinib in lung cancer where it works pretty well. Erlotinib in pancreas, not so good. Higher toxicity. But one I like to point out is VEGF inhibitors in colon cancer. We now have 3 that are out there. And so Bev, a drug we consider to be quite expensive to start with, a hazard ratio showing benefit, expensive costs were in, but then came aflibercept, same basic hazard ratio, higher toxicity. So what would you charge? Not double, right? So this is where our craziness got. If I still to this day wish that the makers of aflibercept had priced it at half. They would have sold it to 1 billion more people than on the world that currently can't afford VEGF inhibitors, and it would become our VEGF inhibitor of choice, and we'd figure out how to deal with the higher toxicity because it probably is otherwise the same drug. Our healthcare system's fragmented right now. Each component makes its own individual and discrete decisions, and it has its own lobby. You think the gun lobby's strong, you should see pharma. It's very effective, okay? 1 in 2 in terms of influence on Capitol Hill, where I come from. So what we need, of course, is an interconnected system in which the various components are complementary. But how the heck are we going to get there? How do we get through the door and the metamorphosis? And as a good Presbyterian boy, how do we make it to the pearly gates? So we do what we do in Washington day in, day out. We come together and we listen to each other. That's what we're going to do. And most importantly, and not joking, we respect what we hear. We need to learn to hear the other's perspective and not just build the defense against what they're saying, right? Why are they saying it? Why do they believe that? And can we figure out a way to weave the common threads and weave a new fabric, and ultimately provide global health care with value. So where are we? Where have we left? Where are we going? This movie Gravity, have you seen this? So, you know, they let go of the space station and float somewhere and land on the other side. We're in floating right now. We've let go of the old days. We kind of know where we're going, but we don't know how long it's going to take or exactly where we're going to land. We're going away from a consumption model to an outcomes model, from individual practices to healthcare systems where we will all wear the same sweatshirts and hats and those kinds of things. Where only rich countries, the 1 billion, can afford the treatment, to where all countries can. We are doing less and less with microscopes and more gene profiling. Safety and efficacy will go the way of value. Large trials will become small and enriched. We will do away with trials that target 1.4 months or designed to even find 1.4 months, back to the FDA-approved target of substantial improvement, which doesn't have an actual number to it, but know it when you see it kind of thing. Patient-reported outcomes, patients as partners, standardized data collection. Wouldn't this be nice? I wish that had been the law instead of making everybody do an EMR, and so we all have different EMRs. It's like the Tower of Babel out there. What we needed is standardized. Here's the new way we're going to collect medical data. Institutional IRBs will go to central and national, and ultimately global approvals. So in closing, you know, we do a lot of complaining. We get together, and it's by our nature to complain about our lot. But we also have a very, very important responsibility over the next 10 years. It'll be about 30 years before that's a real doctor-patient relationship. But what we want to leave for them is we want to leave a better place, right? That's our job. Not to whine about the one we have now. We've let go. We've got to build the new one now. But our job is to guide the flow, is to have influence on the flow, to listen to each other, aim for the target. It's about our patients. We're going to be all right. They need us. We're going to be all right. And our job for 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is that doctor-patient relationship can have a kind of conversation of, oh, you've got stage 4 colon cancer. That's not a big deal, because we can cure that. Thank you guys very much.